intended to be a discussion around the essays on accuracy, alignment, awareness, civility, and connectivity, and hopefully kind of a real and interactive way. So I'll start the questions by kind of comparing, I thought, two essays that had a lot of overlap. Kara's on accuracy and Susan's on civility. And one of the overlaps there was this reference to Charlie Savage's article for Politico entitled Where the Culture Wars Hit Fort Wayne. And Kara, in your piece, you mentioned, quote, "It's not merely personal negligence that causes Americans to perpetuate inaccurate, incomplete, or sanitized history. It's also lack of accuracy that has been baked into U.S. historical accounts and monuments by design." So the first question might be, how can you, in your mind, understand a better way to recalibrate our appreciation for accuracy within these discussions? And what does that look like?
Start off with a hard one, Zach.
It's
right
easy
away.
As a softball. I know you're ready.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a starting point is kind of what I was hoping to outline a little bit in my essay there, which is not drawing, false equivalencies between different ideas. I think that a lot of us, even myself, have been raised in kind of this idea of journalism or of thought that just because two opinions are opposite means they might be equal but opposite. When in fact, sometimes opinions that are opposite, just because there's two opposite opinions on something, doesn't really make it a story or doesn't really make both of those opinions equally valid. And I think this is difficult to express because you're talking about people's deeply held beliefs here, or their opinions, or maybe what they were raised to believe. But I think that a conviction to seek out accuracy, to report accurately in my case or in other reporters' case, it really kind of comes back to looking at not just, what two voices are saying around any given issue, but also looking at the wealth of information that we can find about the different issues that we're looking at here, and kind of opening our minds beyond, what the loudest voices are saying, to observe all of the data, all the facts, all of the history that exists around subjects. And I think that can be really challenging sometimes, not only because information is difficult to find, and even more difficult as, the information age floods us with so much information, both accurate and inaccurate, but also because, humans haven't changed a lot in the course of history. And we've always had this desire to make ourselves look good, to present things from our own point of view. And so a lot of our history, a lot of our records have all been kind of tainted by this human condition of, human reporters, human thought processes. And it's really challenging sometimes, I think, to look back at what you've been taught, what you've always held to be true, and to realize how that's all been influenced perhaps by inaccurate sources or biased sources that sometimes didn't even know they were biased. There's not always malice at the end of that. And so I think it can be really challenging. And that's why, we're always revising and constantly correcting, especially in the realm of journalism and news. The news is being presented every single day. You see reports come out every day. And part of that's, I'm sure, to feed the 24/7 news cycle, but that cycle exists for a reason, because we're constantly learning new information and finding better and more accurate ways to process stories and histories and present day realities. And so I think the challenge is just this commitment to constant open-mindedness and constant willingness to look for the most accurate sources and then correct course. That's my kind of summarized quick version, I guess, of how I would respond to that.
Well, what was it I thought was interesting when I reread these and then read Susan's after was your comment about the human condition and this idea that for a couple millennia, there's been a benefit to knowing things, both objectively, but also culturally, right? Garnish respect, reputation, whatever you want to call it. There doesn't seem to be necessarily a direct relationship to that discussion and the need for civility. It doesn't feel like it has that same utility, at least in a current state. But Susan, in your piece, you wrote that the financial frailty of local media organizations, and perhaps more specifically, the continued reduction of competent, committed journalists to examine and report on local issues and decisions made by people in power should be of great concern for all residents of the community. And I wondered, in this discussion of civility and the importance of the public realm that you talk about, how can these discussions, whether they're through journalism or through other avenues, simultaneously become more accurate and civil?
Yeah, that's a tough nut to crack. And I think we have to look first at the local community. So much of the noise comes from the national sphere. And the reality is our local community, our local decision makers are impacting and influencing our lives in a larger way. And yet I am reminded how important local journalism is. Many of us remember Kevin Leininger, and people loved him and hated him, but by God, he made it to every city council meeting and every county council meeting, and he reported what was happening. And when we have local news agencies that can no longer employ people to be at those meetings and actually reporting on it, the access to information of what's happening and the ability to hold local elected leaders accountable becomes really difficult unless every citizen in the community decides to start showing up at those meetings, which I have not seen, nor do I expect to happen. As it comes to grappling with some of the tough social issues that we've been encountering, and this original assignment started in 2020, and boy, that was a year where we saw a lot of these issues bubble over. I think we have to create places and spaces for people to process that information and have civil conversation and meet people that are outside of their immediate bubble of family, church, peer circle. When you engage with somebody who's not like you, you have the opportunity of learning something new or learning a perspective that may be just as valid or, more informed than your own. And over the last couple of years, our ability to bring people together, of course, has been challenged. The kryptonite to an arts and cultural event, is COVID-19, where we have to do social distancing. So as we reemerge into public life, I do think being intentional about bringing stories, cultures, perspectives to the community and spaces to be able to process them and understand them in civil ways is really important. And I think that that's happening here, with Forthcoming. Some people are not going to come to an academic debate. They're just not. They're going to need to have some kind of mechanism that allows them to be part of that in a more entertaining kind of way. That's great. We offer that as a community too. And so, continuing to be intentional and thoughtful about what we are putting on our stages, on what we are hanging in our galleries, in the conversations we're having in our civics classes, in our schools. I think these are really important things to be doing.
Susan, in your piece, you mentioned almost a 60-year-old quote by Dr. King when he was in Fort Wayne. And it was interesting to me because I thought it was an interesting quote to serve as an umbrella for all 5 topics today. The quote was, "We're through with gradualism, tokenism, see how far you've come-ism. We're through with the we've done more for you people than anyone else-ism." And what's interesting to me about these 5 topics, accuracy, alignment, awareness, civility, connectivity, is in some way it feels like it's trying to understand how we can get better at disagreeing, and try to show some empathy that's backed with some information. It's something that I don't think we do well as a human species. We seem to do horrible at it at a national scale, and then spend all of our energy arguing there as opposed to focusing on the local. But I know Kristen, John, you talk about this, but that's kind of maybe an open discussion for everybody. Is I wonder how these discussions can be both disagreeable and empathetic to the problems we're trying to solve, And how do we get better at doing that as a community?
I'll start since you dropped my first
I
and
did.
last, my Christian name there. Okay, so I've been off of social media for like 2 months now, and I'm in here, I think, in my capacity to build movements on social media, which I think is why you asked me to do this, right? And one of, I think, the answers that's bubbling up for me is something that I'm flopping around that's like a cold take. Cold takes, lukewarm takes, anything other than hot takes. The idea that the memification of information has made us all angry all of the time, has made us either a victim or an oppressor all of the time. And in order to fit something complex into 140 characters or a graphic, you have to turn it into a hot take. Susan and Kara both referenced our local government. I have a cold take, okay? Maybe everyone will have one at some point. We do bipartisanship so well in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Nobody's gonna retweet that. It's boring, but it doesn't make it any less true. If you look at how often our council people move across the lines for important projects, I'm sitting in one of them right now at Electric Works. It is a super cold take. Someone I shared it with the people I'm gonna be working with, and they said, Fort Wayne Community Schools has an amazing school board. The Journal Gazette wouldn't even print that, necessarily, right? It's a cold take. And I think in many ways, the answer is like how we relate with the people that we love is what we need to scale. It's not how we relate with someone that we're mad at or how we relate on social media. I don't greet my children in the morning with a hot take. I'm like, did you wet the bed? It's a cold take, okay? It's a cold take. So it's something that I'm chewing on and that I hope if I ever do go back to social media, that I will be a part of the boringization of social media, the calming, the safe place, but not in like the snowflake sense, the safe place as in we communicate like we respect the heck out of each other, not like we're trying to go viral.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kristen. And it really kind of speaks to actually what Input Fort Wayne was created to do in some ways, which is kind of a new emerging, I guess I shouldn't say new, I don't know how old it is, but it seems to be new emerging field of journalism called solutions journalism, which is kind of focused on this idea of, historically, ever since, probably the beginning of journalism, but amplified since Watergate specifically, journalism has kind of leaned in toward talking about problems in communities and governments and places and organizations. And not that that's not important, because there's certainly a lot of problems that need to be solved and, conspiracies that need to be unearthed, things like that. But the solutions journalism is really about approaching those challenges, not just from the angle of where are things going wrong, but also who is working to make those issues better, or who is working to improve situations for individuals and communities. And so I think just by kind of leaning in, and it doesn't mean, like you said, it doesn't have to be this happy-go-lucky, people always say you're the positive news outlet, which sometimes I'm like, maybe, sometimes it's positive. It's certainly more uplifting to hear about people working towards solutions than just a bunch of problems that a community has. But it doesn't always have to be a happy-go-lucky positive thing. A lot of times these are really challenging issues, things we should be leaning in on, and kind of leaning into the complexity. I think that, when you're quick to categorize something as either good or bad, it's really an oversimplification of whatever it is, because every situation in and of itself is good, but also bad. And there are positives and negatives, and even great things. I mean, I would categorize like Electric Works opening as a good thing. I'm a homeowner in the area. It's going to increase my property value. But also along with that comes a lot of challenges for a lot of people, and so I think the thing throughout this experience for me was kind of being more comfortable with the complexity of that. I think Fort Wayne has this tendency to think, if you're not cheerleading Fort Wayne, if you're not saying everything about Fort Wayne is amazing and this is awesome, then you're a Debbie Downer, or the opposite. If you're criticizing Fort Wayne all the time, you're just a horrible person. And why don't you just move? But what we actually need is more people willing to love this place and to lean into the challenges that it has, and to be comfortable, not comfortable with that in the case sense that, we're complacent with challenges, but comfortable realizing, this is something both good and bad, and how can we amplify the good and reduce the bad for as many people as possible. That's my hot take, I guess. cold take.
It's interesting on this cold take. I like that phrase, Kristen. I'm reminded of, so Chris Margaselli and Dan both probably have a comment here, and you addressed it, but in this idea of cold take, I do a lot of work in small towns, specifically with public libraries, and we're always talking about the history or legacy of a place. And my favorite thing to do, because it's really easy and it's a cheap trick, but if you just pull like early 1900s postcards of any community, the amount of pride for these places is over the top. I mean, you would have thought we're talking about like the Lincoln Center, Wells County, Bluffton has these wonderful postcards talking about the parlor city of America. And it's clear it's the greatest place ever created. And the community is very positive and opinionated that it is. And that was how traditionally, I think, we talked about our communities, partly because of pride, but partly for survival. But that's not a hot take anymore. Similarly, I was at a panel discussion a few years ago now. And when I said where I was from, and everyone thinks Fort Wayne's in Texas. So I said, no, it's Northeast Indiana. And they said, oh, that's the highest per capita robot operators in the country. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, no, I mean, for all the automotive manufacturing sector, per capita, you have the highest percentage of robot operators. And coming from, a long line of people that worked in factories and manufacturing, I've never met a single person in Indiana that said, okay, bye kids, I'm going to go operate my robot. You just say, I'm going to go to the factory. We just don't see it that way. But it's exactly what they're doing. But that's a different take on that. And it's interesting to hear these discussions and talk about civility, but it also might equally be important to talk about humility, and sometimes the good and bad of that. So that's a rambling way to say, Dan or Kristen, when we're talking about these discussions, what is that cold take, that humility part of it? How is it impacting our awareness or lack of awareness of where we stand as a community?
I'll start, because I think you used a quote that a gentleman I had interviewed out of California. He was the one that made the remark about, one of the biggest mistakes we can make is always assume or treat the historical legacy of something as its ultimate strength. And when he then referred to it as a sense of arrogance, like the light bulb went off for me, because I'm like, I never really thought about it in the sense of, wow, that can be really arrogant and does not demonstrate humility. But I come from an 80-year-old family-owned business, and we respect the heck out of the history and the legacies of how this community bank was built. But we know what got you to year 80 is probably not what's going to get you to year 150, right? So everyone flips to this mode of respect the wisdom and the experience, but let's think about how we transform. And he was probably the most interesting person I had interviewed in this, and it really stemmed from that statement. And he's probably one of the most humble people I know as well. So it's interesting that you bring up the concept of humility, but I think it's one of those essential things. And as I loved that everyone had a word that they tied their paper to, right? And so when I read our 5 words, I'm very Italian, and I thought about our words in terms of how you make a spaghetti sauce, oddly enough. And when you just mentioned, how can we get better at disagreeing and about conflict? You can kind of tell when you make a spaghetti sauce that's missing something, right? It's like one of those ingredients is out. And if any one of those 5 ingredients is out, then your sauce is it's bland, right? It's missing something. And so I look at that with all of the different words that I think also reflect like core values of leadership, that all of these things are absolutely essential. And that to me is how we will become better at conflict resolution as well.
I would just, jumping in on that, you talked about the idea of diverse or, conflicting ideas or backgrounds. And I think I just finished my master's in community development. And really, was really fascinating. You know, you go through this whole program thinking it's one thing, and then on the other end, they tell you it's something completely different when you graduate. And I was defending my thesis, and it was really, it was just a great conversation I had with them. And it's like the whole point of community development is to bring people with diverse ideas together, diverse set of thought together to work positively towards a common solution. So it's, you know, how do we make X better? Well, you could always go with the one idea, or you bring two different people or two groups of people together that have completely different ideas, as long as they both want to make something better. And then be able to collect those thoughts from both sides and then come towards a common consensus of what is it going to take to make things better, which is really a good lesson for me and something that I'm trying to do with my job, with my community, with my neighborhood, with my friends and family. And
but I'm going to keep using Kristen's language. What I'm always interested in is when cold takes aren't as hot as I think they should be. And the one that sticks with me, and I say to everybody that'll listen, is women with more robust social networks are 400% more likely to survive breast cancer. And to me, the first time I heard that, I was like, why doesn't everyone know? Like, that should be like, you know, the number one thing you know when you talk about neighborhood development. Like, is this worth the budget for new sidewalks? I don't know. What's the value of increasing the chance of surviving breast cancer by 400%? I'm more than happy to have that conversation. But it's treated like a cold take because largely I think within the discussion of specifically these 5 topics, I think sometimes it's hard to assign a cost to it, and everyone wants you to. You know, what's the value, what's the worth in dollars of these things? And it's getting better, I think nationally in some of these more nerdy circles, but locally I don't know. Dan and Susan both mentioned the work of Robert Putnam, the book Bowling Alone. And it brings a question within this discussion of how do we understand how to leverage cold takes relative to social capital in a way that they become real discussions about this in a civil and meaningful and probably accurate way.
I have a thought on that, and that is have to be proactive in inviting people to the table to have the conversation. You know, they're brimming with pride. When we've worked, and Dan was very much part of the development of a public art commission and the creation of a public art master plan. What we didn't talk about was sculptures, murals. What we did talk about was who do we want to be remembering? Whose voices do we want to uplift? What stories should we be telling? What is the identity of our community? And do we have many identities of our community or communities? And how do we make sure that we're honoring all of these different perspectives and identities and stories? And so, you know, the only way that we were able to get that information is to go to people and ask them to be part of a conversation with us. And I think that's what really good community development does, and what the work that Dan is doing at the city, the work that I think Kara is highlighting in her journalism, the reason why we have an electric works, you know, why we're starting to build momentum on entrepreneurship and innovation, you know, in the necessary focus on manufacturing 4.0 is because our community's leaders are going to people and asking for their input and starting to build plans and put resources behind those plans to get things done. Is it perfect? Is it is every process a slam dunk? No, you know, we're all human and, you know, things evolve, but the fact that our community is committed to doing that. And another observation, I think, Kristen Giant, you mentioned how great it is and how much of a cold take it is, the fact that our elected leaders do work in a bipartisan way often. And I think our elected folks do that well, but so does our economic development organizations. When our leadership in this community is aligned around key priorities, boy, there's nothing stopping us. And the way that our leadership knows what is a key priority is by being proactive and seeking that input from the community.
I think that's so good. And if I might interject with my road trip analogy, which is what my article was about, I feel a sense of urgency when we get an idea that can be so isolating to earning trust, can be so isolating when there's a deadline, especially to communities who, and this isn't any of our fault on the call, but who have met your deadline before and had everything that they said ignored. Okay, so now you tell me there's a deadline again. So I'm already feeling a sense of, I work 3 jobs, I can't make your deadline. But my desire to show up at that meeting when my grandma did, you ignored what she said. And it's family lore, because these things are passed down, not only literally through the stories that we tell each other, but epigenetically, the history of redlining and economic deprivation is we set these goals and we hire companies to, make the GPS and to sell them, but you're selling to me, you're selling to one audience. And it can feel like Siri, and that was kind of the metaphor. It can feel like someone saying like, you have made a wrong turn. And it's like, no, the magic was down that wrong turn. That was the magic. And you listened and you overcorrected and you almost hit a pedestrian because you're rushing so fast to get to the right way. And I think that our elected officials do a really, really great job. I would love to see, and I know this is anathema totally to economic development, but some meaningful brake pumping, like real brake pumping, to say, we'd rather arrive there together. And I think there's an example right now that could be the elephant in the room that I don't need to mention by exact topic. But what would it look like to say we are going to truly pump the brakes on this decision that clearly didn't have community buy-in? Because so often it's you're invited, and when you don't come, we've all done it. I mean, I can't speak for all of you. I'll admit that I've done it. I've worked for private equity firms. I've worked for major foundations. I still work with a foundation where we say, well, they didn't show up. We think we know what they want. Let's go forward. And just less of that, I think, is super important. And it slows things down. And that's the worst, because we love hitting these metrics. But if we hit them and not everyone feels included, then why did we even do it?
Yeah, I have kind of 2 reflections. I think one, Kristen, I love the point that you mentioned there, because I was going to kind of relate it to what you talked about in your article of kind of wanting to see that destination or wanting to categorize something before we've gone through the journey of really knowing what it is. And I think that, that's a natural human tendency. Our minds like to put things in categories, good or bad or right or wrong, or, Democrat, Republican. And so I just think the more we can push back against that, and I think, there is that sense of arrogance in some ways of, wanting to categorize something or say, this is our plan, or kind of claim, this is what we're doing. But there's also just kind of that real human desire to understand things. And I think it can stem from both of those things, a number of factors. But I think that the more we can push back against that, the more we can kind of question why we're doing what we're doing, or why the plan is what the plan is, or why it's working, the system's working the way it is. I think the more we can reach that accurate and effective solution. And there's a interesting parable. I listened to the Minimalist podcast. I don't know if any of you guys listened to that before, but they always kind of come back to this idea that, you can't really tell always what something is going to be in the present moment. And so they have this, I think it was an ancient Chinese parable where, one day the parable goes something to this effect that a farmer has a son, his son goes out and breaks his leg, and everyone comes running up to the farmer and says, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That's so horrible that your son broke his leg. And the farmer says, maybe. And then, the next day, the army comes to enlist all the young boys in the town to go to the war. And the farmer's son can't go to war, and everyone comes running up to the farmer and says, gosh, your son was so lucky. That's so amazing that he broke his leg. Now your son's not going to go to war. And the farmer says, maybe, and then each day it kind of keeps going back and forth with the farmer always responding maybe, and the town always, some random circumstance coming up and the town rushing to him to kind of categorize it, to say that this was good or bad or moralize it in some way. But the parable of the story is essentially that we can't always tell, because we don't know what, today's effects are going to have on tomorrow's world or situation. And so I think, we're all limited in our capacity as humans. Even if we do try to be as accurate as possible, there are going to probably be things that slip through the cracks. So we just need to be constantly having, I think, that maybe mindset of like, electric works is great, electric works is horrible. Well, maybe, like, let's keep working, let's keep making it better. But it does take a level of humility. So I think that's a super important word. And a great cold take. I just saw Kristen post a little note in the chat box there. So yeah, I think leaning more into that. I always try to remind myself of that parable whenever I'm like, oh, this is horrible, or oh, this is amazing, maybe.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is interesting, Dan's whole world, I think, revolves around this, but I think too often, and this isn't addressed to you, Dan, these conversations that are trying to cultivate some sense of membership or community, a sense of community, usually only get really screwed up by well-trained experts, like architects, and largely, I think, due to how poorly the questions are that are supposed to spark conversation. I had a mentor once tell me, you can really screw all this up by asking the wrong questions. Like, just because someone doesn't know the longitude and latitude of their home doesn't mean they don't know where they live, right? But too often we ask these really complicated questions, usually on topics people haven't really given them much thought to, and then wait for them to respond within minutes, and then say, okay, I guess that's what we want. Well, it's like, it's complicated. I haven't thought about it too much. And to me, that whole kind of focus group mentality of thinking that's what's going to help communities think through some of these issues isn't nearly as effective as learning alongside them of what the real challenges are and the maybes, of these things that aren't so bipolar as they seem if you ask really sloppy questions. So, Dan, how, in your experience, is there a better way that we should understand how we can understand connectivity, kind of in these conversations on the neighborhoods term, not necessarily the trained professionals term?
Yeah, I might be a little bit controversial in my own field on this at times. I've gotten a little bit of pushback from some folks, not necessarily in the city, but other places. And I think there's two things. First is embedded planning. I think it's so important. And it's hard to do, especially say if you're a private consultant, because you're being paid by the hour to go out and try to meet certain metrics. But embedding yourself in the community, you can watch those relationships. You can, observatory planning is so important. So you're out, you're understanding the way people interact with each other, how they answer questions together or separate from each other. And then, kind of just study and follow that through the process and make better decisions based off of those relationships you've built. So that's where embedded planning comes in. And it's really hard to do because you have to give up a lot of time and energy and effort to do it. But I think there's so much value in that. And then I think when you talk about asking the right question, that I don't know how many times I've sat through, not necessarily in my job here, but charrettes in other jobs or even in my schooling. It's always one of the first questions is, well, what's wrong with this space? Or how would, what went wrong or what happened wrong or whatever. And I think ABCD, if anybody's read anything by John Kretzmann and McKnight, it really starts with that. Instead of that glass half empty, it's about the glass half full. So you build off strengths versus weaknesses, and you start looking at the positives of the area. And there's going to be things that come out through that. And that's really important. That's where the embedded side comes in, is then you can start to see where the weaknesses are. But as soon as you start asking right away, what's the weakness or what's the problem, you're going to compile even more, or, just compound more problems on top of that instead of trying to get to the solutions.
I think it can be a hard balance sometimes too. Sorry, not to just take things off course, but we have talked about, Fort Wayne's great bipartisanship among its elected officials. I actually am a little bit concerned about our elected officials, if I'm going to be honest, because, while there are some good examples and there are some good things that happen, I do think our political system in general is set up to not support this maybe mindset or this questioning mindset in order to get elected, in order to advance yourself in our current political systems, you have to have this level of arrogance, this level of, I'm certain of this, and, you know, I'm for this, I'm against that, you know. It requires a lot of certainty, or a sense of certainty. And so I think we see that play out in a lot of unfortunate ways on the local level too, of people being a little too sure of themselves and not fully checking things, and in a lot of ways not being forced to check things, which was the point of my article. In a lot of ways, you know, elected officials passed an entire day based on a fact about Anthony Wayne that's not even true, and that wasn't even verified, even though the sources were there to verify it. So I'm currently, I guess, at a little bit of a loss for optimism, I think, on some of our elected officials and some of our processes in the community, if I'm going to be really honest. So I think that's the part where civility and some of these issues get challenging for me, because when you don't have faith in the system, we can try to be nice and we can try to be working within the system to improve things. But at what point do you have to go outside of the current system that exists in order to actually improve the situation? So I think that's where, not to throw a wrench into the conversation, but that's where my mind's going.
What I'd wonder though is it faith in the system or faith in the populace? I think to have these conversations, we tend to oversimplify the categories, usually because we think we have to dumb down the discussion because it's too complicated. We do that with politics all the time, but we do it for a lot of different reasons. When we talk about the creative sector, I don't think most people would lump robot technicians in that. But it's 30% of our economy, and I would argue very creative and focused on relying on creativity and innovation to survive in terms of attracting and retaining talent. But that overcomplicates the problem. So we'll just call creative people that like art, right? And which isn't at all what we're talking about, but it seems simpler, and this is too complicated for, you know, the entire community to understand. And to me, those categories tend to be part of this problem, is we don't have faith that people actually could understand themselves, which is a really weird way to go about community development. And I think sets the stage for inaccuracies and a lack of awareness to almost be a default reality to some of these discussions. You see it a lot in politics, which I hear you, Kara. But we also see it in almost all these complicated discussions, is we try to put these ideas in separate pillars so we can isolate them when they're not isolated at all. Quality of life is healthcare. The creative sector is innovation. Like, these things aren't siloed. And we don't seem to have a lot of discussions for various reasons, but that really try as best they can to let the community develop their own roadmap to navigate these in a really imperfect and messy way, which is exactly how communities were intended to evolve, not perfectly and mistakeless.
You know, on that subject, can I ask a question? And this is a question, Kristen. You know, we've kind of debated the merits of planning versus more organic routes, but, you know, we have the privilege of thinking in the ideal world, and the messiness happens when idealism meets reality. You know, there are constraints, there are responsibilities. If somebody doesn't do something, nothing gets done. And as we think about the alignment or sometimes misbalance of idealism versus reality, where do you think our manufacturing is going in this community, knowing how critical it is to the future of Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Not a softball. Thank you. I also have a lawnmower going on in the background, so I apologize if you hear that. I almost started writing this down the path of just focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation. And the reason why I immediately thought of that area is every year I look at the statistic of how Indiana is doing for the number of adults who start a new business every month. And for the last decade, Indiana has been in like the bottom 10, usually the bottom 5 in the country. And I don't think the private sector often thinks about entrepreneurship as one of its keys to success and economic growth, because the reality is the number one source of net new job growth is coming from companies that are ages 0 to 5. right? And so I started going on this path of like, how do you get everyone to care about that, right? How do you hug an entrepreneur, hug an innovator? Because that's where our growth and transformation is going to come from. But when I started to just apply it to a single sector, I'll be honest, I did not interview a single owner of a manufacturing business. And they may be of the mindset that we're good, right? We know where our innovation's coming from. We're going to transform and we're going to be here for the long haul. When I saw the sheer statistic of the fact that it is 30% of the jobs in the region, I was like, man, that would be such a blow if they were to go away. And if we aren't also taking care of people who might start that next great manufacturing company right here in Fort Wayne. So that was just staggering to me. And maybe they're figuring out how to reboot and recharge and forge ahead. But it was just the whole staggering notion of the significance of that percentage was enough. Wow to me.
The other common thread, I think, was this idea or notion of, quote, investment. Both what Kristen's talking about now and trying to invest, almost like intellectual infrastructure, just trying to understand what that looks like on the landscape. All the way to maybe the other end of the spectrum was Dan's discussion on investing capital at the neighborhood level and accepting or embracing that investment in a certain way. What role does our redefinition of investment play in this discussion of, I think I told you we wouldn't have many softballs, but I think some of the problem in a lot of these discussions is the oversimplification of the word value, right? Oh, that'd be great, but, or, well, that seems expensive. Well, relative to what cost? And part of this, especially in the accuracy of it, is trying to be aware of what that investment looks like and what the ramifications are of disinvestment. And at the heart, I think that was part of the real discussion around electric works was, if not this, what? The problem doesn't go away and we're still leveraged with cost. And the argument could be cost with no value or a project that you may or may not agree with, but we can talk about it. But under the umbrella of actually agreeing on words that have real definitions like cost and value. How do you have that discussion, both in a civil way, which is usually the problem, but in a way that it's not just dictated by trained experts, professionals, people in the roadmap business?
One of the things that I was reading through when it comes to about value and understanding how to sell it to people, I think Theresa May, when she launched her initiative in the United Kingdom about the Minister of Loneliness, I think is what it was called, and I forget, but it was really fascinating. So it wasn't necessarily, and so many times we put numbers with value, obviously, because that's just the easy thing to do. But what she did with that campaign was, it was faces. So they called it the outside or the inside out campaign. And I think it was so well done. It was faces of seniors in these communities on walls. And it said, this is why we need to invest in our community. It wasn't, we need to invest X and get Y. It was, we need to invest in this person and have them live another 4 or 5 years or whatever it might be, and so when sometimes we, value and investment, sometimes we need to be able to tell the story versus just the, and sometimes it's the cold take. The hot take can be the fancy new number that we see, but sometimes it's the cold take is the story or the life behind that number.
Yeah, I think an important question to ask is who benefits, because when you're talking about investment, it just kind of sparked to my mind a couple stories about investments I've read over the years in certain parts of the community. And you'll see a business come in and say, let's say it's a park and, they're going to make an investment. Well, who benefits from a public park? That's, an entire neighborhood. There's no cost to, there's cost to individuals to create the park, but there's no cost to the average human to walk through a park besides, maybe what you pay in your taxes to upkeep it through the city. But you can dissect that in any number of ways. But, then let's say it's not a park. Let's say a private business from another city comes in and puts a McDonald's franchise here. Who benefits from that? So I think that these questions are just important to ask as we're thinking about cities and communities. You know, what is this investment? Why does it qualify as an investment? Is this how our community wants to define what an investment means in this neighborhood or in this city or in this place? And if that's not it, then what is this? And, you know, ultimately, who's benefiting from it?
I think it's interesting to think about investments as, this could be a terrible analogy, but as a supply chain, right? And if all of us here are, let's say we're rallying around an investment in something, and you think about where your time or your effort, your funding, your resources, where it's going to plug in on that investment supply chain. And using manufacturing as an example, right? Who's investing in the kids to get them robotics kits to make sure they can learn, right? For what it's going to look like. And who's investing in the maker spaces to make sure they can create. And so I've tried to start to think about investments. It's not just about how many dollars and what's the ROI, right? Everyone has a role to play in that supply chain of success for what an investment ultimately is and should be.
I think that assembly line analogy is right, though, because I think too often we have these discussions about investment without admitting that there's a finite amount of resources and there's a critical path, you know, to get where we want to go. And that's where I think these oversimplified categories hurt us. It's either or, well, this project or that, or this or that, or we can't do them all at the same time. But if you got rid of or blurred the lines in the categories, you could say, well, if I do this, it makes this one easier. If we do this one first, and this one becomes third and not fourth, and have some sense of at least an understanding of a path forward, a path that will ultimately change. You know, it never goes the way it's supposed to, but it would help us, I think, be more sophisticated and honest about how we're defining these investments.
I think
acknowledging that they're finite resources, but there's different ways to leverage them more advantageously than others.
I love that. One of my favorite books in the innovation space is Innovation Blind Spot. And in the book, the author Ross Baird talks about how we didn't always know how to recruit for college sports. Some really trailblazing coaches realized, why am I not looking at high schoolers? Why am I not traveling the country watching high school reels? Now, in a very short period of time, that model transformed. We have not yet found that model for innovation and entrepreneurship. We're getting closer every day. But, you know, I think one of the things, Kristen, that you said that I connect with so deeply is it's an assembly line. Each of those items is sourced. Every, you know, the assembly belt itself is sourced. So when you start looking farther and farther down that supply chain question, there's these, the hot take is you realize that an equity is baked into every single level, and, you know, white people are the only people that can win, and all we're doing is just, you know, increasing the gap. Okay, hot take, done, got it out. I can make a TikTok about it. The colder take is at every single one of those steps, there's an opportunity to intersect with an equity lens. And you also shared a statistic, Kristen, that most of the net new jobs are from new businesses. If you end up hiring someone, 94% of firms that make one hire rely on some kind of financial assistant, 94%. The number one source of that financial assistance, family and friends fund. So then you start to examine the wealth gap. This is why we started the Family and Friends Fund. Family and Friends funding is that huge source for those entrepreneurs that can then hire someone. Mm-hmm. So how do we assess that gap? And how do we make sure that everyone is ready to receive capital? Because as someone who's invested, you know, equity capital, grant capital, it is true that people need to be ready to receive it. It is absolutely true. And it's something I'm excited about here at AmpLab, is to have investment ready graduates for their business ventures, people who understand it if they go the college route or if they go into another firm, is what did that money look like? How did you get it? And how are they ready for it? So I think each one of those intersections is an opportunity, and we can always put up different maybe lenses: equity, access, history, futurism, and maybe that makes us go slower. Back to that point, it's not that I don't like going fast, although I don't, because cars are so big and scary. But it's that, like, we don't get to put on all the lenses if we're going too fast. We might just miss one of the stops on the supply chain. I thought that was a great analogy.
One question I wanted to ask this group, maybe the closing big question. I wonder what this group thinks of how the heritage of a place impacts our future. You know, like, do articles like Politico's make it difficult, make it impossible, have no real impact, but serve as a hot take? I wonder, how does an awareness of these inaccuracies and incivilities limit our ability to align and connect with one another? And it seems like under that umbrella is where these kind of 5 essays were trying to live. But I have a hard time having that discussion without at least acknowledging or discussing what the heritage or reputation of a place serves as a starting point for we can go from here. And I think that's why so many people mentioned an article like that, is because I think it starts to assign or revise or refine the reputation of a place, especially from outsiders looking in. And it's something that all of us in our daily lives then have to combat. So I'm curious how these 5 topics in your mind are impacted by that heritage, whether it's real or perceived, and perceived sometimes is more important, and how do we treat that as a starting point to have these discussions moving forward?
You know, one of the things I'm really proud of in this community is that we've gotten our swagger back. And if all of us were here 10, 12, 15 years ago, it was really common for people to apologize for living in Fort Wayne, or for somebody moving, oh, I'm sorry you had to move here. You know, that was really common. And so when we hear our brand as a community getting communicated to the world as a place of intolerance, it's a real problem, because that's the hot take, like Kristen said, that's not who we really are, but we've got to tell the story of who we are more accurately. One of the things that's resonated with me over the years is the Knight Foundation, and they did a study of Fort Wayne and 26 other communities in 2008, 9, and 10. And they asked people, well, what makes your community sticky? What are the things that help you feel attached to your community, that you belong there? And we know that communities that are sticky are places where people choose to go and choose to stay and choose to invest and build businesses and build lives and all of that. And they said that the top 3 reasons why communities are sticky are beyond public safety and good schools and, you know, all of those good things, which are traditional, and we love those, we need those in our community. But they were community aesthetics. You know, do you have a green space that you can go walk to? Is it a beautiful place? Do you like being there? It was social and entertainment options. And where can I go meet more people? Where can I have that social capital, that social infrastructure? And it was inclusivity and welcomeness. And do I belong here? Are my ideas valued here? Can I be part of the decision making? And in not only in Fort Wayne, but in most of the 26 communities, the metric that we had the most challenge with was inclusivity. And so when we hear, you know, a county councilman talk about uneducated voters who unfortunately breed during the Black Lives Matter movement, when we go through RFRA as a state, when we have a national journalist like Charlie Savage put in Politico magazine that we're putting inaccurate information into celebrating Anthony Wayne Day that just wasn't true, you know, and we're making policies on that. People make decisions. Am I going to move to this place where I might not feel very welcome? You know, is this a place where I want to go and build a business and, you know, hire my first 5 or 10 people? You know, are there going to be 5 or 10 people for me to hire there? And I think we have to have a conversation in this community about who we want our identity or identities to be, and make sure we're telling the good stories, the cold takes, so that we can counteract some of the things that are just not a good reflection of who we are, or who we want to be.
I think the hard thing about heritage is you don't always get to choose it, but it is a part of you, whether you like it or not. Kind of like family, you know. But in thinking about a place and its heritage, that's even more so true because a lot of us weren't alive or didn't have that connection, and yet we've grown up in this system. We've been baked into it, and it's as much a part of us as our families are in some ways. And so I think in looking at, where do we go from here? I think it's important to realize too, as much as we do, I love what Susan said about telling good stories. I think that's why input exists in a lot of ways. We want to be telling those stories because there certainly are good things happening here, but also we got here for a reason. And I think we need to take a good look at that. And, the reason that City Council was able to pass some of these, the Wayne Day measure, and the reason it has gone unchecked, it's happened for a reason. And so I think that, there's certainly like the human side of it, of like choosing what we believe, but there's also a very practical side of this too, of there are laws in place, there are systems in place, reasons why things are the way they are. The way Fort Wayne and Allen County interact, I think, is a super interesting and important thing that reporters should be investigating a little bit more, to be honest, because this county actually dictates the way that our city operates on some ways. And so the city and county are, constantly working, they're not constantly working closely together, but maybe there should be more interaction there. And I think that that's something we should be calling into question a little bit more is, we got to where we are by certain systems. Where are those systems working in our favor? Where are those systems leading us to where we want to go? And where are those systems failing us? And maybe they didn't always fail us, but they are failing us now. And how do we make just really practical changes to adjust the systems, not just to benefit one person, but to benefit, people more broadly who's benefiting? So I guess that's my thought.
Anyone else on that one?
Go ahead, Kristen.
You're good. Go ahead. You're hilarious. The only two things that came to mind is like, man, wouldn't it be great if when it comes to heritage, everyone shared two beliefs? And one was that there'd have to be a belief that what has happened in the past is influencing what we're choosing to do today and in the future, right? That there's some kind of connection between past and future. And so what if we all believed that that were the case? And what if we all believed that the one thing that could unify is heritage, right? Like, let's come together and rally around that. Cool. And I mean, it sounds very simple, I get it, but I was like, if those two things could happen, it could help define why exactly rallying around our past could be exactly what we need for the future.
I love that. My reframe takes a similar approach, which is, you said, what are we going to do because we have to grapple with this, that we're forced to? And if you've been in a marriage, if you've been in a friendship, you know that that's the good stuff, man. It doesn't feel good at the time. That is the good stuff. That is the good stuff. Grappling with the truth, that is the good stuff. Is it hard? Yeah, fuck yeah, it's hard. You can edit that out if you want, but it's true and it was necessary. It is very hard. And lots of good things are very hard. And I get emotional talking about it because our addiction to avoiding hard conversations is literally killing people. It's literally killing people. Deaths of despair are so tied to the inability to talk about complicated things together. So what a gift. What a gift that he came in and published that in Politico. What a gift, because it invited us to the work that we should have already done, to Kara's point, right? What a gift that we had a photographer featured in national publications during our Black Lives Matter rallies. What a gift, because it forced us to look in the mirror together, not look in the mirror alone, right? We're talking some Harry Potter. We're all looking in this mirror together and seeing the future that we want and the past that we haven't reckoned with. What an invitation. What an invitation. And without it, we are a press release. We are a shiny pamphlet. With it, we are a city. We are a community. We are a family. And it doesn't mean that it's not hard. It doesn't mean that it's not awful. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't burn you out. It does. And you heal and you come back and you do it again. And everyone on this call is such a huge part of that for our community. And I'm so grateful that I get to have hard conversations and rumble with each of you I'm with so many other people. I want to keep doing it. I want to stay in the hard as long as we can, and heal and grow and celebrate too. But like, the hard is where all the good stuff happens.
I don't even know how to follow up from that, but that's really powerful. But I do want to say, Jane Jacobs might be one of my favorite, it inspired me in so many ways. And she has this really powerful quote that I think we all really should live by and operate by in so many ways. And it's, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And that to me is that speaks volumes on so many levels, but it's really about making sure the right people, well, not even just right people, but everybody's at the table, in the decision-making process, and that voices are heard no matter what voices they are, and not putting on a, glossy pamphlet from time to time, but making sure that we're getting through these conversations, the good, the hard, everything.
Well, Dan, you successfully put a bow on this. That Jan Jacobs quote is the preface of the forthcoming book. So I know we could have this conversation for another 2 hours. I also know you guys have day jobs. So I wanted to just take a real quick moment to thank everyone, not only for doing this, but for giving it the attention it deserved. And really, I think trying to tackle some issues in a way that you probably don't get asked to tackle it very often. And spending some time and giving them the attention that they deserved, and reflect a little bit and share your kind of perspective on this. The hope with this discussion wasn't to find a right answer, but to show the multiplicity of things people are juggling with and the way that they're going about them. So, not that I have the ability to thank you on behalf of the entire community, but I'm going to anyway. Thank you for this. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the thoughtfulness. And maybe more importantly, thank you for your courage in really tackling these issues with some sincerity and empathy. And I hope it's not the last time we have this discussion. So thank you for taking the time. And I can't tell you how much we appreciated your input. So thank you for the discussion today.
Zach, thank you for coordinating and facilitating these conversations. They are so important to bring smart people together to grapple with these issues, because 20 years is going to be here before we know it. We live lives, we're busy, things happen, kids grow, jobs evolve, all of that stuff. In 20 years, if we're not thoughtful about it now, we could be in much the same place we are now. And I think we've identified so many of the opportunities for growth, that we need to be tackling. So I'm pretty confident the people around this screen, me excluded, could probably fix it all. So I appreciate all that you are all doing.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zach.